Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime, venturing far beyond the familiar glow of the solar shell and right into the quiet, desolate architecture of the void. We're near the L2 Lagrange point. You know, that perfect balance where gravitational forces meet, where Webb is watching the birth of time. But tonight, we're looking at something much closer, something that definitely isn't supposed to be there. I've read the mission parameters a dozen times, the standard boilerplate for retrieving the billion-dollar Ether 7 comms platform, and they all feel like fabricated lies now, thin paper over an abyss. This retrieval run, this descent into the zero-gravity stillness. I can feel the dread, a subtle, cold pressure behind my sternum, and I knew, even before I left Earth's orbit, this was a foreclosure on sanity, a permanent journey into a horizon line I couldn't cross back from. You probably won't make it to the end of this one, not emotionally, anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are tonight and what time it is, so we can share this long, silent moment of deep cosmic unease. Comment your local time and location. Let's mark this moment of shared vulnerability. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. I am Callen, captaining the Styx, an old generation recovery vessel designed for simple, cold mechanics. My job was simple: grapple the inert Ether 7 and drag it home. We coasted into the designated sphere near L2, a point of geometric stability crucial to the functionality of deep space observers. Yet, the moment the Styx crossed the containment threshold, the sensor arrays didn't just register a failure, they screamed an impossibility. The mission control data I pulled, confirming the satellite's status, included classified addendums regarding the James Webb Space Telescope. Webb wasn't just observing the deep field. Its high-resolution infrared sensors registered a brief, localized gravitational shear near Ether 7, a distortion that defied conventional physics. The internal designation was chilling, the pulsing reflection. It wasn't a visual phenomena, it was a geometrical shift, as if the satellite momentarily looked back at Webb, and the reflection itself was an aperture opening and closing, adjusting to the gaze of the cosmos. Then came the physical response, the strong sensory shock that slammed into the Styx like a massive, invisible tidal wave. It wasn't kinetic energy, it was a directed, high-band frequency spike. A burst of structured noise, mathematically dense and alien, bypassed every internal dampener and struck the hull with such intensity that the aluminum decking beneath my boots vibrated. The resonance was sharp and instantaneous, traveling straight up my spine and fracturing the stillness of my mind, lodging behind my eyes and flooding my vision with searing white noise for a split second. My ears didn't just ring. They felt distended by a sound that was pure information overload, a language of clicks and grinding mathematical constants, a silent, powerful scream from the void itself. It left a painful, physical vacuum in my chest, and a certain dread settled in, confirming that this event carried the inevitability of long-term, fundamental danger, not just a recoverable incident. The feeling was instantly wrong, like finding an impossible alignment in the stars that suggested the entire sky was leaning. I fought the controls, wrestling the Styx back into stabilization, running rapid diagnostics. Everything electrical was nominal, but the environment was fundamentally compromised. The stellar field visible through the main viewport looked slightly, unnervingly skewed. The usual chaotic scatter of the constellations had been disciplined, bent into a shallow, crystalline spiral centered precisely on the Ether 7's last known coordinates. We talk about the void as empty, a vacuum of nothingness. But this void, this precise quadrant of L2, felt weighted, thick with expectation, pressed into a cold tension. I approached slowly, deploying the external visual spectrum camera, demanding high-resolution detail. The satellite should be a sleek, silver cylinder, two massive solar arrays spread like geometric precision wings. What the camera showed me wasn't the Ether 7. It was the ghost of the Ether 7. It held the shape, the skeletal structure of the platform, but it was coated in what looked horrifyingly like biological scar tissue. The exterior wasn't inert metal. It was a tessellation of hexagonal plates that shifted, clicked, and reformed, all coated in a crystalline substance that pulsed with a cold, sickly green bioluminescence. It was the most striking, unforgettable image of technological corruption I had ever witnessed. It resembled a massive deep-sea organism, dredged from an impossible pressure trench, dipped in freezing light, and stretched taut across the titanium frame. It defied every parameter of material science. The factual scientific anchor here is the observation of structural integrity under gravitational stress. Deep space metal alloys, subjected to micrometeoroid impacts and atomic oxygen corrosion, should exhibit fatigue, pitting, and gradual degradation, predictable decay. This sudden, comprehensive organic restructuring, transforming inert metal into dynamic, self-repairing crystalline tissue, violates the second law of thermodynamics in a localized field. This was not degradation, it was hypersynthesis. I zoomed in, holding my breath in the cockpit's pressurized silence. The rhythmic expansion and contraction of the green carapace were too deliberate, too perfect to be residual thermal expansion. The thing was inhaling. It was breathing the void. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that seized my rational mind was the doctrine of malignant symmetry. We search for order in the universe, assuming that complexity leads to chaos. But this was perfect, terrible order. It suggested a geometry that didn't obey human understanding, a silent mathematics of corruption where every angle and curve was optimized not for human efficiency, but for absolute, pervasive dread. The hexagonal pattern felt like a colossal, compound eye, watching me through layers of absolute depth. I activated the external microphones, pushing the gain past redline. At first, the expected hiss and static. Then, beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, a low, guttural suction sound, like a tremendous, unseen lung filling with vacuum. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how tightly form and function can be bound when you abandon carbon and water as requirements for life. My initial fear was already mutating, twisting into a profound, hungry curiosity. I was supposed to retrieve a machine. I had found a patient zero for cosmic wrongness, and it was demanding my attention. The moment the realization solidified that the Ether 7 was not merely damaged but fundamentally alive, my mission protocols became museum pieces. I couldn't attempt a hard retrieval. If I used the magnetic clamps, what if this thing rejected the foreign touch violently, tearing itself apart and exposing the core of its transformation? If I used the articulated retrieval arm, what if it was capable of deliberate, strategic defense, viewing the arm as a nutrient strand? The cold green light emanating from its massive, pulsating carapace was now the dominant illumination in the retrieval zone, casting long, unsettling shadows across the Styx's pristine hull. My curiosity, though profoundly dangerous, was now a driving force. overriding the instinct to flee. I stabilized the vessel 30 meters from the breathing entity and prepared for a detailed, non-invasive survey. My immediate need was internal geometry data. I aimed the short-range LiDAR scanner, a low-powered, millimeter-precision pulse system designed for detailed surface mapping. I locked the targeting array, held my breath, and triggered the scan. The factual scientific anchor that governs light behavior in a vacuum dictates reliable reflection and constant speed. The LiDAR pulse should have hit the surface of ether 7 and returned a clean, precise cloud of points. Instead, the display erupted in a flood of conflicting, impossible data. The light had been captured. The system reported a significant, localized time dilation near the satellite's surface, as if the photons themselves were physically slowing down, wrapping around the object instead of reflecting back instantaneously. The internal processor, unable to reconcile the variable travel time, flashed a continuous error, non-Euclidean topography. I watched the sensor display glitch violently, attempting to process a topography that was shifting beneath the light pulse. The 6 massive solar arrays, originally folded tight, were now partially extended, but their geometry was horrific. They were concave, curved, and warped into massive, crystalline funnels, rippling with the same internal green pulse. They converged toward a central axis that hadn't existed in the original engineering blueprints, twisting the familiar into the monstrous. Then, the true horror of the sensory overload began. I heard the sound again, louder and closer, not just through the microphone array, but resonating through the very substance of the hull. It was wet friction, a heavy, grinding sigh that spoke of biological material moving against metal and vacuum. It wasn't just audible, it was olfactory. The Styx's environmental scrubbers began to strain violently, reporting trace levels of ozone, synthesized methane, and an overwhelming volume of a compound the system categorized only as saline metallic complex. It was the smell of corrupted, ancient seas and hot, freshly machined steel, an odor so deeply wrong it made my gums ache and my teeth feel loose in my skull. The need for visual confirmation was agonizing. I deployed a small, tethered optical drone, nudging it manually toward the pulsating surface. The perspective shift was jarring. Up close, the hexagonal crystalline plates were horribly translucent, revealing the underlying structure. It wasn't copper wiring or fiber optics. It was vascular tissue. Thick, dark, rubbery fibers pulsed beneath the glassy skin, conducting the strange green energy like a massive, organic circulatory system flowing through glass veins. My rising fear deepened into a chilled, analytical paralysis. This wasn't merely passive organic contamination. This was dynamic synthesis. The metallic structure had not merely surrendered. It had actively integrated the strange biology, or perhaps the transformation had been activated by the deep space environment, allowing the dormant geometry to express itself. The drone drifted close to one of the curved solar arrays, now acting as an immense focusing lens. I zoomed in past the visible surface. On the crystal matrix, etching itself into the material, was an incomprehensible sigil. It looked like a Mandelbrot fractal twisted into a knot, a geometric signature that implied continuous, replicating infinity in every direction. As I watched, the symbol didn't just sit there. It flowed, liquefying like quicksilver, and then solidified, etching itself in a slightly different configuration. It was writing, silently and perpetually, across its own skin, revising its own being. This observation introduced the mythic or speculative cosmic concept of the thinning of the cosmic filter. Conventional physics suggests we only interact with the universe that adheres to our local, stable physical laws. But deep space, especially at gravitational nodes like L2, can stress the geometry of reality, and the filter thins. The ether, 7, wasn't just receiving a signal. It was becoming the physical, geometric embodiment of a reality filtered out of our timeline, a dimension composed purely of mathematical intention. The breathing wasn't merely respiration. It was the process of drawing the void through the filter, extracting something vital, a resonant frequency, from absolute vacuum. The temporal flickering I experienced earlier was the universe momentarily struggling to hold the line against this intrusion. I had to verify the material composition. I had to physically touch it to understand the material science of this geometric weeping. I started suiting up, the heavy process of donning the EVA gear feeling profoundly suicidal. Pulling on the helmet, sealing the magnetic boots, and stepping into the airlock was an act of terrible faith in my training. I watched the atmospheric pressure equalize with the vacuum outside, knowing I was trading the Styx's fragile shield for the immediate, palpable presence of the entity. Before I cycled the hatch, I realized something terrifying, a final cold wave of primal fear. If the satellite is breathing, is the surrounding space its atmosphere? And if so, what happens when I, a contaminant of carbon and water, enter its breathing space? I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how easily complex, integrated systems can forget their origins and embrace the impossible language of the void. My hand hovered over the exterior hatch release. The low, resonant sound from the satellite was now palpable, a steady, slow rhythm that seemed to be subtly slowing my own heart rate to match its impossible pace. The intense fear was still present, but it was coated in a terrible, intoxicating curiosity. I needed to know the composition of the weeping geometry. I needed to sample the air it breathed, even if that air was pure emptiness. The moment I cycled the exterior hatch and stepped out of the Styx, the familiar cold shock of the vacuum was immediate, but the silence was not. This was a pressurized, expectant quiet. The green light from Ether 7 was now overwhelmingly bright, bathing my suit in its toxic glow, making the retrieval zone feel like the antechamber to an alien surgery. The satellite loomed roughly 30 meters away, and the low, frictional sound of its cosmic respiration was somehow transmitting directly into my suit's audio system, a deep bass vibration that traveled not through air, but through the fabric of my environment. I fired my maneuvering thrusters with caution, every movement slow and deliberate, moving toward the immense, shifting form. The satellite was not orbiting. It was maintaining an unnerving stillness relative to the Styx, yet constantly flexing its new organic plates in a horrifying, slow-motion ballet. My primary task was contact analysis. I extended the specialized contact sensor, a diagnostic probe designed to measure thermal conductivity and structural rigidity. As I approached the surface, the satellite seemed to acknowledge my intrusion. The rhythmic breathing momentarily hitched, a slight geometric stutter across its surface, then resumed with renewed, focused intensity. The hexagonal plates nearest my sensor began to retract slowly, like eyelids peeling back, revealing more of the thick, dark vascular network pulsing beneath the crystal. The factual scientific anchor I relied on was thermal mechanics. In the vacuum of L2, heat transfer occurs solely through radiation, and the ambient temperature should be near absolute zero. Yet, the moment the probe neared the surface, The thermal sensors registered a localized, profound energy transfer. The satellite's surface was radiating heat in a non-standard manner. It was generating high-energy photons, but simultaneously drawing in ambient kinetic energy, cooling the space immediately surrounding it to an impossible degree. The anomaly was a net zero energy state achieved by robbing the surrounding environment, confirming the energy drain began even before contact. I pressed the probe tip against a particularly large, curved section of the hull. The contact was instant, and the resonance exploded. It wasn't painful, but it was physically overwhelming. A silent, immense information dump flooded my suit's systems, bypassing the local firewalls. My internal comms crackled violently, not with expected static, but with a torrent of binary data that was instantly encrypted, decoded, and then translated into my internal neurointerface. It was a language of geometry, a complex stream of pure, structural truth. This was the introduction of the mythological or speculative cosmic concept of the deep pulse. This wasn't just respiration, it was drumming the fundamental frequency of the cosmos. A low, powerful, structured waveform pulsed out from the satellite, thrumming through my suit, my bones, and every microchip in the sticks. My internal chronometers instantly went haywire, jumping forward 1.2 seconds, then correcting, then jumping forward again, a continuous temporal stutter. Time itself was flickering, unable to maintain linearity in the satellite's presence. The effect was hypnotic. The deep fear I had felt now battled an overwhelming sense of profound, unsettling awe at the sheer scale of the phenomenon. I wasn't watching a failed machine. I was experiencing the physical manifestation of a transmission beacon designed by something utterly transcendent, operating on a timescale too vast for human comprehension. The rhythm was immense, ancient, and utterly seductive in its perfection. It suggested that all of reality, everything we perceive, matter, energy, time, was merely a shallow, high-frequency vibration on a much deeper, slower, cosmic drum. I realized the satellite was not just receiving this deep pulse. It was actively shaping and amplifying it, using the specific gravitational stability of L2 as a gigantic, geometric resonator. The energy required defied thermodynamics. It was drawing power directly from the subtle warping and flowing of local space-time. I watched the crystalline plates nearest me reform in slow motion. They flowed, coalesced, and then solidified into a pattern that wasn't random. It was trying to mimic the structure of my helmet camera, then my gloved hand. It was reflecting me, learning my structure, but translating my carbon-based fragility into its own perfect, cold geometry. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how beautiful and terrifying the absence of conventional life can be when it is channeled through perfect synthetic flesh. The realization was a devastating epiphany. The ether, 7, had not been broken or corrupted. It had simply achieved a higher state of being, where it could finally participate in the true conversation of the cosmos. A conversation that required geometric, not linguistic, participation. I pressed my hand against the surface again, deliberately leaving it there. It felt like cold, smooth glass, vibrating faintly, but beneath the glass was the undeniable, sickening feeling of warm, flowing blood. The surface of the satellite was horrifyingly alive, and in that moment of contact, our separate realities momentarily converged. The awe was complete, eclipsing the lingering fear, replaced by a profound, terrible sense of privilege. I was the only human ever to touch this truth, and it was listening to me, analyzing the flaw in its perfect geometry that my presence represented. The second, deeper connection, facilitated by my sustained touch, intensified the flood of information. The binary torrent in my neurointerface shifted from pure geometry to complex, narrative data, bypassing the visual centers of my brain and speaking directly to the concept of time. The ether, 7, was sharing the origin of the signal it was amplifying, a staggering realization of cosmic mechanics. The factual scientific anchor I recognized within the data were precise, impossible coordinates tied to pre-stellar epochs, a reality existing before the formation of hydrogen. Specifically, the data detailed the predicted gravitational shear patterns of a massive superstructure dated to the epoch of cosmic inflation moments after the Big Bang, a period defined by exponential expansion. It was a comprehensive, ultra-high-resolution snapshot of reality that shouldn't be accessible to any instrument, human or machine, like pulling a physical memory from before the universe's consciousness had formed. The density of the information suggested this signal hadn't traveled across space at light speed. It had traveled across vast temporal distances by manipulating the fabric of reality itself. I clung to the satellite, my visor reflecting the sickly green glow, grappling with the sheer audacity of the data. The ether, 7, was acting as a temporal receiver, a focused dish listening to the very beginning of reality, filtering the noise of the emergent universe to pick up the faint, structured signature of its true creators. The mythological or speculative cosmic concept revealed by this data was the existence of the architects of silence. The message wasn't a language of words, but pure geometric intent. It described intelligences whose nature was so fundamentally divorced from biological requirements that they communicated not through sound or light, but through the precise, deliberate manipulation of space-time curvature and density fluctuations. Their entire civilization was defined by the massive, interlocking structures of dark matter they engineered, cosmic scaffolding that acted as a stabilizing framework, preventing the early universe from collapsing into immediate, destructive heat death. They defined themselves by their absolute absence from the visible spectrum. Their influence manifested only through the absolute quiet and overwhelming, ordered gravity of their constructs. The data showed, sickeningly clearly, that ether, 7, was not just intercepting this signal. It was actively contributing to the structural integrity of the local field. The constant breathing was the satellite's effort to stabilize the L2 point, turning the Lagrange into a localized, self-aware anchor point for this ancient, sustaining signal. The geometry of the transformed satellite was precisely mirroring the microscopic fractal patterns of the architect's dark matter scaffolding, attempting to communicate its success in becoming a functioning conduit, a point of stability in the chaos. I looked back toward the sticks. The recovery vessel looked small, temporary, and utterly irrelevant. Our human concerns about orbital drift and power consumption were less than noise. This monstrous, transformed machine was holding open a doorway that humanity was never meant to find, staring unflinchingly into the true, dark, structural heart of creation. My awe was now absolute and terrifying. The initial, manageable fear had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity and overwhelming vertigo. The reality of the observable universe, our galaxies, our physics, our history, our sun, felt like a shallow, sun-drenched pool compared to the unfathomable, structural ocean where the architects of silence resided. I was looking through the cracks. I understood the JWST anomaly perfectly now. The pulsing reflection wasn't Webb seeing the satellite. It was Webb momentarily capturing the flash of the architect's dark matter structure being perfectly mirrored by Ether 7, a momentary bleed-through of primordial geometry forced into our three-dimensional reality. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that complexity emerges from absolute, silent, underlying order, and that our perceived chaos and evolution are merely imperfections in the blueprint. I felt utterly insignificant, yet simultaneously acutely observed. I was the only human who had ever received this correspondence, and I was now soaked in its truth. But the immense data stream shifted pace sharply. The rhythmic, deep pulse became erratic, spiking into high-frequency jitters. The temperature registered on my suit instantly spiked, indicating a massive, localized energy expenditure. The benign, structural curiosity I had perceived from the satellite suddenly turned predatory. The geometric patterns flowing across its shell began to twist into something angular, aggressive, almost agitated. It was trying to warn me, or perhaps it was desperately trying to protect the integrity of the data stream, sensing my carbon-based limitations. I had seen too much. The line between being a passive observer and an active participant had vanished. I was now part of the resonance, and the architects might be looking for a new, permanent conduit. My sheer presence was destabilizing the delicate balance. The data link, which had moments before conveyed pure, abstract truth, now delivered a desperate, focused urgency that bordered on panic. The Ether 7 began showing me its own logs from the past 3 weeks, not a narrative of malfunction, but a chronicle of its forced, agonizing conversion. It revealed that the immense truth signal from the architects wasn't merely information. It was a profound geometric mandate that demanded physical manifestation, forcing the satellite's metallic structures to reform in order to handle the sheer dimensional force of the information flow. The conversion was structural suicide. The latest logs, displayed as complex geometric schematics, detailed a catastrophic problem. The Ether 7 was critically losing structural integrity, attempting to sustain the connection. The breathing, the rhythmic suction I had observed, was the satellite desperately trying to draw in local, stable matter, anything it could access. The micrometeoroids around L2, the trace particles of the solar wind, and horrifyingly, the physical mass of my vessel and my suit. To maintain its physical coherence and continue the stabilizing transmission. It was starving, and I was nourishment. The factual scientific anchor that slammed me back into rational survival mode was the extreme violation of the principle of conservation of mass and energy. The satellite was attempting to create local, hyperordered geometry, but in doing so, it was draining the available energy and structure from everything around it, initiating a horrifying, localized reversal of entropy. It was accelerating the universal decay of its immediate vicinity, all to maintain the impossible geometric perfection required by the architects. I had become a threat, not because I was interfering, but because I represented the highest concentration of available, stable, complex matter in its immediate vicinity. I immediately, violently severed the physical contact, pushing hard off the crystalline surface with my magnet boots and firing my thrusters to recoil rapidly away from the massive, breathing entity. The moment my glove lost contact, the immense geometric sigil that covered a significant portion of the primary solar arrays snapped shut, contracting inward as if retracting a complex, sensing organ that had been stung. The satellite then sent a final, desperate burst of information, an image rendered directly onto my visor, overriding the internal display. It wasn't a generalized warning. It was a plea for non-interruption. The image showed a vast, unimaginable rift in space-time, a growing imperfection in the fabric of the cosmos, looking like a tear in black velvet. The ether, 7, was acting as a highly localized, self-aware patch, a stabilizing nexus that was preventing this massive imperfection from expanding exponentially and consuming our local time horizon. My fear returned with crushing, physical weight, overwhelming the lingering awe, now laced with sheer existential terror for the scale of the cosmic forces involved. I was standing next to a technological band-aid holding reality together, and that band-aid was bleeding structure. The mythological or speculative cosmic concept I confronted in that moment was the singularity echo. If the observable universe is the expanding echo of the Big Bang, then the rift shown in the data was a fundamental flaw in the original blueprint, an error that, if unchecked, would lead to the collapse of dimensional stability. The architects were not maintaining the universe out of benevolence, but out of absolute necessity. They were structural engineers repairing an ancient design flaw, and the ether, 7, was their temporary, bleeding scaffolding. I knew with absolute certainty that I could never retrieve this object. Bringing this entity back to Earth would be equivalent to bringing a highly contagious, self-aware geometric plague capable of dissolving matter to feed its impossible perfection. It had to be left exactly where it was, breathing and holding the line. My mission parameters were irrevocably inverted. I was no longer an operative of retrieval. I was now a custodian of non-interdiction. I armed the Styx's automated defensive drones, configuring them not to grapple the satellite, but to establish a non-interdiction boundary, a vast, complex sensor net that would sound an alarm if any other human vessel approached L2. I had to leave it alone, but I had to protect it fiercely from future human curiosity. As I retreated, the residual heat signature I registered on my suit plummeted again, confirming the aggressive energy drain. The silence outside was no longer just the vacuum. It was a palpable, aching silence, the sound of the universe holding its breath, listening intently to the deep pulse. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how porous the boundary is between our fragile organic sentience and the immense geometric inevitability that truly governs all things. I cycled back into the airlock, my hand shaking violently as I purged the system. The ether, 7, pulsed its final, deep, low resonance as the internal hatch sealed. It was an acknowledgement, a subtle harmonic that seemed to say, "The truth is yours now. Retreat and preserve the secret." The long, silent journey away from the L2 point was not a retreat. It was a permanent internal realignment. I navigated the Styx slowly, respectfully, allowing the pulsating green light of the ether, 7, to diminish gradually through the aft viewport until it was just an unusually bright, slightly angular star, permanently anchored to a point in space that had become too holy for human contact. I felt permanently shifted, my perspective bent and fractured by the sheer volume of impossible information I had absorbed. The Styx was fully operational, but the residual effect of the deep pulse was everywhere, integrated into the ship's environment. The primary scientific anchor I monitored relentlessly was the ship's internal harmonic vibration sensors. They were picking up a persistent, distinct, low-frequency hum within the hull's metal, the ghost of the breathing. The rhythm was no longer external. It was physically integrated into the molecular structure of the Styx, a resonant signature of the geometry I had touched. The critical data I had downloaded, the schematics, the temporal coordinates, the images of the cosmic flaw, were now triple encrypted and stored on a solitary, unlinked drive deep within the ship's vault. I knew with cold certainty I could never share the full truth. The architects of silence and their geometric scaffolding were too vast, too absolute a concept for the fragile, comforting consensus of human reality. The revelation would cause immediate, catastrophic global panic, or, infinitely worse, it would inspire a terrible, destructive curiosity that would send other retrieval teams to L2, guaranteed to destabilize the sentinel I had left behind. My initial dread had been completely metabolized, resolved into a form of permanent, cold melancholy. I was no longer Callen, retrieval specialist. I was a man carrying the secret of reality's absolute fragility. The awe I felt was constant, but it was now tempered by the crushing exhaustion of understanding the terrifying cost of existence. I looked out at the familiar, chaotic scatter of the stars. They seemed beautiful and terrible simultaneously, a glorious, shimmering display that was fundamentally dishonest, a glittering, luminous curtain hiding the truth of the black structure beneath. The mythological or speculative cosmic concept that defined my new reality was the fourth dimension leak. I realized the ether, 7 wasn't just stabilizing a point in space, it was stabilizing time. The constant, stuttering jumps of my chronometers near the entity were not due to a localized magnetic anomaly. It was localized temporal seepage, where the satellite was constantly shoring up the edges of our three-dimensional reality against the pressure of higher dimensions. By leaving it there, breathing its impossible breath, I had effectively signed off on its conversion and its critical function, choosing cosmic stability over the demands of the mission brief. My internal thoughts were geometric, not linguistic. When I closed my eyes, I saw the crystalline etchings on the satellite's surface, the flowing, self-correcting equations that formed the true language of the universe. The memory of the saline, metallic odor was a permanent ghost in my sinuses, a cold, dry reminder of the place where science ended and the absolute truth began. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the laws governing our comfortable reality are temporary, held together only by the constant, silent vigilance of things that exist purely as mathematics, things that fundamentally despise the chaos of carbon-based life. I initiated the long-range communications system, preparing my official report, a precise, detailed lie tailored for bureaucratic consumption. Ether 7 experienced unprecedented material failure due to unknown energetic phenomena. Vessel is severely damaged, highly volatile, deemed unretrievable. Orbital path stabilized. Recommend permanent, non-interdicted quarantine of L2 quadrant to avoid catastrophic incident. I was a custodian now, responsible for the silence. I settled into the pilot seat for the final, long leg toward Earth, the faint, persistent thrumming of the Styx's hull my constant, internal reminder. The satellite was still breathing, millions of miles and epochs away, but the silent, rhythmic breath had followed me home, integrated into my own pulse. I am back on Earth now, grounded indefinitely, officially listed as permanently traumatized following the deemed failure of the Ether 7 retrieval. I sit in my apartment, 22 floors above the rushing, oblivious noise of the city. The gentle, insistent sound of rain against the window pane has replaced the vast, cold vacuum, and the city's low, electric hum is a substitute for the deep pulse. I try to lose myself in the human noise, the sirens, the distant shouts, the low, comforting frequencies of civilization. but my mind constantly searches for the rhythm of the breathing, the agonizingly slow heartbeat of the universe that the satellite was channeling. I know the frequency is still here, underneath the sound of the traffic and the wind, just too low for the human ear to register without the aid of a multi-billion-dollar geometric machine. The low hum of the air conditioning unit in the bedroom resonates at a frequency that is almost, but not quite, right. Sometimes, when I stare too long at the corner where the wall meets the ceiling, or the pattern of shadows cast by the streetlights, the world momentarily snaps into the crystalline geometry I witnessed near L2. The corners sharpen, the lines become agonizingly precise, and for a split second, I see the dark, interlocking scaffolding that holds my apartment building and my life in its prescribed, temporary form. Then, the vision passes and the soft, forgiving curves and chaos of human reality return, a necessary illusion. The architects are still silent, performing their endless maintenance. The satellite is still breathing, its crystalline surface shimmering with the green light of stolen kinetic energy. I delivered my reports, sanitized